Toulouse, France. The sky over Toulouse was clear on the morning of October 25, 2024, but there was something in the air I couldn't quite place. The city was buzzing with anticipation. It was the first day of the cultural parade, an event that promised to be grand. Families gathered in the streets, children holding balloons, and musicians preparing to play their songs. However, my keen eyes caught details most ignored: the tense expressions of some organizers, the restless murmurs among a few spectators, and the sculptures on the floats. The figures, which were supposed to evoke folklore legends, seemed off, distorted expressions, eyes that appeared to observe those passing by. I wasn't there for fun. For months, a trail of clues had led me to Toulouse. My name is Thomas Vallet, and my profession, although officially described as a private investigator, is much more complicated than that. I specialize in cases most people would consider absurd: unexplained disappearances, phenomena that defy logic, and events that leave behind a trail of fear and silence. The message I received a week before the parade was brief but alarming. Something big is about to happen in Toulouse. If you don't investigate, the world will never be the same. There was no sender, just an address for a meeting. It was enough to make me follow, even without knowing what awaited me. The cafe where I met my contact was small, discreet, and tucked away on a side street. The man seemed nervous, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to be following him. He spoke quickly, his voice low and trembling. "You're late," he began, without greeting me. "It all starts tonight." "What exactly starts?" I asked, trying not to show impatience. He hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. "They're trying to summon something ancient, something that should never be brought back." "Who are they?" He glanced around, as if someone might overhear us, even though it was just the two of us in the room. "Powerful people. Politicians, businessmen, leaders of organizations you couldn't even imagine exist. They're using the parade as a distraction. While everyone is watching the festivities, the real events are happening at 5 different locations." He pulled a map from his pocket, marked with 5 locations: Albi, Mon-tauban, Cordes-sur-Sille, Saint Bertrand-de-Comminges, and Narbonne. "Go to Albi first. If you don't believe me yet, what you see there will change your mind." Before I could ask more questions, he stood abruptly. "Be careful, Thomas. They know who you are." And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with the map and the chilling sense that something was terribly wrong. I drove to Albi at dusk. The road was winding, cutting through vast, silent fields. When I arrived at the indicated location, I found an old building hidden among tall, dense trees. It looked abandoned, but a faint light seeped through the cracks in the windows. The interior was spacious, with stone walls covered in moss and a high ceiling that amplified the faintest sounds. In the center was a large metal vessel, illuminated by torches. Hooded figures surrounded it, murmuring in a language I couldn't identify. Their voices echoed, creating an unsettling resonance. One by one, they brought objects into the circle's center. I couldn't see all the details, but it was clear each item held symbolic significance. When the group's leader began chanting loudly, the room's temperature dropped abruptly. The vessel began emitting an intense light, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air pressure rose. I struggled to breathe, as if something invisible was draining the oxygen. I left before I could be discovered, but my mind couldn't process what I had just witnessed. From Albi, I went straight to Mon-tauban. The smaller, more isolated town had a different atmosphere. The house marked on the map was hidden along a dirt path surrounded by trees. As soon as I entered, I felt the tension in the air. In the center of the room, a long table was set with items arranged like a banquet, but there was something deeply wrong about them. Some appeared ancient, covered in inscriptions I didn't recognize. Others had disturbing shapes that churned my stomach. The participants entered silently, sitting at the table with uneasy expressions. The group's leader, dressed in a robe embroidered with gold, began to speak in a grave tone, using words that seemed to carry a weight of their own. Suddenly, they began chanting. The air vibrated, and my head throbbed. Something alive was in that place, something that shouldn't have been there. Before I could be discovered, I left quickly, but the sound of their chants lingered in my mind long after. My next stop was Cordes-sur-Sille, a medieval village known for its beauty. But beneath its cobblestone streets and charming houses lay something sinister. The catacombs beneath the village were the site of the next ritual. I followed a narrow tunnel until it opened into a wide chamber, lit by a central flame. The fire wasn't normal. It pulsed, constantly changing colors, as if it were alive. Participants poured substances into the flame while chanting in higher, more urgent tones than I'd heard before. The flame grew with each added substance, and the room's heat became stifling. But the most disturbing part was the sensation of being watched. Even while hidden, I felt unseen eyes fixed on me. I left before the discomfort turned to panic. My penultimate stop was St. Bertrand de Comminges, where I witnessed the most unsettling ritual yet. In an ancient building, a black stone altar stood at the center. Participants approached it one by one, placing something on the altar as the leader recited chants. The energy in the room was almost tangible, like an invisible presence filling the space. Finally, I arrived in Narbonne. The energy of the place was unlike anything I had felt before. At the center of a hall, a large circle was drawn, made up of intricate symbols that seemed to faintly glow. Participants were positioned around the circle, holding objects that appeared to culminate everything I had witnessed. The leader raised a staff, and the energy in the air peaked unbearably. Suddenly, the circle shone intensely, and something emerged in its center. It had no defined shape, but its presence was overwhelming. I left before I could see more, but I knew something had been summoned. When I returned to Toulouse, the parade was ending. The streets were still full of families, completely unaware of what had happened. The following days were confusing. What I had witnessed in each city haunted me, but the scariest part was what followed. Small events began appearing in the news: blackouts, outbreaks of violence, unexplainable disappearances. Everything seemed connected, but I had no way to prove it. I received one final message on my phone. "You've seen too much. Stop now before it's too late." I never discovered who sent the message, but I knew they were watching me. Today, I look at the map and feel a chill down my spine. What happened in Toulouse wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, and I fear that when the consequences fully manifest, it will be too late for all of us. Returning home didn't bring the sense of relief I expected. My small apartment in Paris, where I used to find refuge, felt colder, emptier. The nights were far too quiet, except for the echoes of chants still ringing in my mind. I spent days reviewing my notes. Every detail I had recorded felt like part of an impossible puzzle. The 5 cities, the rituals, the symbols, the chants. Everything pointed to something I still couldn't fully grasp. I knew I had witnessed something monumental, but what exactly? The news began pouring in. Reports of strange events in the cities where the rituals had occurred. Inexplicable bursts of light in Albi, abnormal heat waves in Mon-tauban, animals behaving erratically in Cour-de-Cerceal. In St. Bertrand de Comminges, locals reported hearing strange sounds from the building where I had been. But Narbonne disturbed me most. Satellite images showed an anomaly in the sky above the city, something scientists described as an unusual electromagnetic phenomenon. Each piece of information seemed to confirm what I feared. Something had been unleashed, something that was growing. One night, while analyzing the news, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice came from the other end. Thomas. It was the contact I had met in Toulouse. His voice was tense but determined. "We need to talk. They won't stop." We arranged to meet at a hotel on the outskirts of Paris. When I saw him, he looked even more worn than before. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Do you have any idea what they've done?" he asked bluntly. "I have some ideas, but I want to hear it from you." He placed a file on the table. Inside were photos and documents detailing the rituals. These rituals weren't just about summoning something. They opened a door. A door? To where? He hesitated before answering. To another plane of existence. Something that had been dormant has been awakened, and now it's influencing our world. His words hit me like a punch. Everything started to make sense. The strange events, the oppressive sensations I had felt at each location. "Why did you tell me this?" I asked. "Why didn't you run away like anyone else would?" He looked me in the eyes, and I saw something in them that left me unsettled. Because I've been on the other side too, and I know what they're capable of. Before I could ask anything else, the sound of footsteps in the hallway alerted us. Someone was coming. The man stood quickly. "Don't trust anyone, Thomas. Not even me." He slipped out through the back door, disappearing once more. In the following days, I began to notice I was being followed. Unknown cars were parked near my building. Strangers stared at me too long on the streets. One night, as I returned home, I found the door ajar. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one detail. The map my contact had given me was on the table, now marked with a red circle around a new location. The circle indicated a small, isolated town called Epernay. There was no obvious reason for it to be connected to the previous events, but I knew I had to go. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different. There were no rituals, no symbols, no chants. But there was something in the air, a suffocating silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath. As I walked through the deserted streets, I noticed the windows were shut, the lights off. It was as if the residents had vanished. I entered an abandoned cafe and found a stack of papers on the counter. They were scribbled notes filled with symbols I recognized from the rituals. Suddenly, I felt I was no longer alone. A figure emerged from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," said a low voice, almost a whisper. I turned slowly and saw a tall man with eyes that glowed unnaturally. Before I could react, he stepped closer. "What was awakened in Narbonne is growing, and you're part of it, whether you want to be or not." I ran. I fled the cafe and got back to my car, but as I drove out of town, something told me I wouldn't escape. In the weeks that followed, my paranoia grew. I tried to share my discoveries with a trusted journalist, but he disappeared shortly after our conversation. My phone began receiving cryptic messages, always signed with a symbol I had seen in the rituals. And then, one night, I woke to the sound of something scratching at my window. My apartment is on the 5th floor. I looked outside and saw nothing, but the symbol was etched into the glass, as if it had been burned there. Now, I don't know who to trust anymore. The news continues to report inexplicable events around the world. Sudden storms, outbreaks of mass hysteria, lights in the sky. I know everything is connected to what I saw in Toulouse and the surrounding towns. This is my last attempt to document what happened. If something happens to me, I hope these words serve as a warning. Something has been awakened. Something that cannot be controlled. And the worst part, I think they're just getting started. My paranoia has become a constant companion. The nights feel longer, the silence of my apartment filled with imagined echoes and shadows I'm certain move without reason. Every noise in the building's hallway feels like a harbinger of something I don't want to face. The symbol burned into the window haunts me. No matter how hard I tried to erase it, it remained like a scar. I started to suspect that the glass wasn't simply marked. It seemed as if the material itself had been altered, as though the symbol was part of a new reality overlapping ours. I spent days trying to find patterns in the events that had followed the rituals. Each clue seemed to lead to a new dead end, yet something told me I was close to understanding what was happening. Then I received an unexpected message, but this time, not through my phone. A letter appeared beneath my apartment door. It had no sender, just a folded piece of paper with the words, "Come to where it all began. The answer is waiting for you." I knew what it meant. Toulouse. Returning there felt like suicide, but my curiosity, or perhaps my need to understand what was happening, was stronger than my fear. I packed a bag with the essentials and left early the next morning. When I arrived in the city, it looked different from before. The parade had ended weeks ago, but the streets still bore traces of the celebration. Faded banners, deflated balloons stuck to poles, and graffiti on the walls with symbols I recognized immediately. The address that had first brought me to Toulouse was empty. The cafe was closed, its windows boarded up. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. One window's boards had been removed, as if someone wanted me to enter. Inside, the cafe was abandoned, covered in dust, with broken furniture. However, on the floor, I found something that froze my blood. The map my contact had given me, now marked with a new point. This time, the destination was a place called Rocamadour, a small, isolated village nestled into a cliff in southern France. I drove there that same night. The road was winding and treacherous, and my car's headlights were the only thing illuminating the way. When I finally arrived, I was met with a sight straight out of a nightmare. The village was deserted. Ancient stone houses hung over the cliff as if they were about to fall. A thick mist blanketed the streets, and the silence was so absolute I could hear my own heartbeat. I walked through the narrow streets until I found a staircase leading down to a church built into the rock. That's where the map pointed. The door was ajar, creaking slowly as if inviting me in. Inside the church, I found a series of symbols carved into the walls. They seemed to glow faintly under the dim light of candles that were still burning, as if someone had been there recently. The altar, however, was empty. As I investigated, I heard footsteps. My heart raced. I hid behind a pillar and waited. A figure entered the church. It was the same man who had met me at the cafe in Toulouse. He looked different, pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken as if something had drained his essence. "You came," he said in a whisper. "I knew you would. What's happening?" I asked, stepping out of the shadows. "Why did you bring me here?" He laughed, but there was something disturbing in the sound. Because you're part of this, Thomas. You always have been. Part of what? I demanded, feeling my stomach churn. He approached the altar and pointed to the symbols. What started in Toulouse was just the beginning. They needed a channel, someone to witness, to document, and to carry what was awakened. What are you talking about? Look around you. Do you think all of this is a coincidence? You were destined to be here. Before I could respond, something in the church's atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. A deep, almost imperceptible sound began to echo, as if coming from within the rock. They're coming, he said with an empty smile. And you can't stop them. Lights began flickering around the room, and a dizzying sensation overtook me. Everything seemed to spin. When I tried to move, my legs wouldn't respond. The man took a step forward, extending his hand. Accept it, Thomas. It's inevitable. Suddenly, the church was filled with an intense light, and everything disappeared. When I woke, I was lying on the church floor, but something was different. Daylight streamed through the windows, and the symbols on the walls were gone. The man had vanished. I stood up with difficulty, feeling my body heavy, as if I had been carrying something far beyond my capacity. I left the church, but the village was still deserted. It was as if time had stopped. I got back into the car and drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. There were no answers, just a growing sense that something inside me had changed. Since then, strange things have started to happen. Objects in my home move on their own. At night, I hear whispers I can't locate. And in my dreams, I see the man again, always smiling, always watching me. Now, as I write this, I feel like I'm being watched. What began in Toulouse isn't over. And this time, I fear it's me carrying what was awakened. Returning to Paris should have been the end of everything. A chance to step away, reorganize my thoughts, and perhaps begin to forget what I had seen. But instead, it became the start of a new phase in the nightmare. The feeling of being watched never disappeared. It began subtly, glimpses of shadows where there shouldn't have been any, the sense of movement in the corner of my vision. Then it became impossible to ignore. Objects in my home started shifting places. Drawers I knew were closed would be opened by morning. Important papers vanished only to reappear in spots I'd never leave them. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I barely slept, ate poorly, and the accumulated stress of the past weeks seemed to be breaking me. But then I began to hear it, always at night, in the silence of my apartment. Low voices, murmuring words I couldn't decipher. Sometimes there was laughter, dry and distant, as if coming from another room. One night, I woke to a peculiar sound, claws scratching at my bedroom door. I leapt out of bed, my heart racing, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The next day, I went to the police. I explained that I believed my home had been broken into, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been inside. "Perhaps you need some rest, sir," the officer said, noting my dark circles. "The mind can play tricks on us when we're tired." But it wasn't my mind. I knew that. That night, while trying to ignore the now constant whispers, I noticed something new. My skin looked different. At first, I thought it was exhaustion, reddish patches appearing on my arms and chest. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw the patches formed patterns. Intricate lines spreading like roots, pulsing beneath my skin. The symbols. I panicked. I tried washing, scrubbing, but nothing worked. It was as if they were a part of me now. I grabbed a scalpel from an old first aid kit and made a small cut on one of the marks, trying to remove it. Blood oozed out, but the mark remained unchanged. I was transforming. In the days that followed, I avoided leaving the house, staying locked inside with the windows shut. I tried to understand what was happening, poring over old books and searching for answers online. What little I found only terrified me further. Esoteric texts spoke of marks like mine, described as seals, linking the bearer to a force beyond our world. The voices started coming during the day, louder, more insistent. Sometimes they whispered my name. Other times they laughed as if mocking me. It was then that I received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. But something inside me knew I couldn't run. When I opened the door, I found a tall man dressed in an immaculate suit. He seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong to this world. "Thomas Valet?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "May I come in? We have important matters to discuss." Something in his gaze prevented me from refusing. He entered, surveying the apartment with a clinical eye before sitting in my favorite armchair, as if he already owned the place. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I'd like. He smiled. You can call me Adrian. I represent interests. Interests? What kind of interests? The ones you now serve, whether you realize it or not. My stomach churned. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, Thomas, don't be naive. You were in Toulouse. You saw what you weren't supposed to see. And now, you're a part of it. His words hung in the air like a sentence. A part of what? I asked, struggling to maintain composure. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine. Something was awakened. Something that needs a channel to fully manifest. And you were chosen. My heart raced. I didn't choose anything. Perhaps not consciously. But you were in the right place at the right time. And now there's no escaping it. He stood, adjusting his suit calmly. Soon you'll understand. But until then, a piece of advice: stop resisting. The more you fight it, the stronger the connection becomes. And with that, he left, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. In the days that followed, things worsened. The symbols on my skin began to move, as if they were alive. The whispers turned into screams, echoing in my mind until I could no longer think. One night, I was awakened by a deafening sound. My apartment was filled with pulsating light, and the shadows on the walls danced as if they had wills of their own. At the center of the room, something began to take shape. It wasn't human. It wasn't something I could describe in words. But I knew it was the beginning of what Adrian had mentioned. Something was manifesting through me. I ran out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to escape. I drove aimlessly for hours until I spotted a simple, isolated hotel. I rented a room and locked the door, trying to gather my thoughts. But the symbols burned. My body felt like it was on fire, each line pulsing, as if something was trying to break free from within me. And then I heard it again. Thomas. The voice was clear, firm. It didn't come from outside. It was inside me. You're ready. I closed my eyes, feeling despair take hold. What had I become? The pain was unbearable. The marks on my skin pulsed with an intensity that made me feel as though I was being consumed from within. Each pulse was accompanied by a feverish heat, as if the very air around me was distorting. In the quiet of the hotel room, surrounded by shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe, I tried to find a moment of relief. My thoughts were jumbled, caught between the terror of what I had witnessed and the growing sensation that something far worse was about to happen. I sat on the cold floor, my head in my hands. The voices still murmured, but now they were clear enough for me to understand. They called my name repeatedly and spoke fragments of commands or sentences. You are the channel. The connection is made. There is no turning back. For the first time, I realized these words weren't just echoes in my mind. Something inside me was responding to them, something that was growing. I looked again at the marks on my arm, now appearing brighter, more alive. Each line moved, forming patterns that constantly shifted as if they were preparing me for something. My senses began to fail. The air in the room felt dense, hard to breathe. The dim light from the lamp flickered, and I knew I was on the verge of another event. Then it happened. The lamp's light went out completely, plunging the room into oppressive darkness. A low sound, like that of an old machine, began to echo, though there was no machine nearby. The shadows on the walls started moving again, stretching into impossible shapes, as if something was about to cross from another place into that small room. You're ready, Thomas. The voice came directly from within me, clear and unmistakable. It was a statement. I felt a pull in the center of my chest, as though something was trying to push its way out of my body. The pain was so intense that I fell to the floor, unable to breathe. The shadows in the room seemed to gather in a single point, forming a figure that was barely discernible. It was tall, dense, but had no definite form. It was like looking at something the brain couldn't fully comprehend. The passage is open. The figure spoke. The voice didn't come from a mouth, but was everywhere, filling the space and resonating inside my mind. What do you want from me? I managed to whisper, my voice weak and desperate. You are the chosen one, the seal that connects us to the human world. Your resistance is futile. With that, the figure began to move toward me. It didn't walk but seemed to glide, approaching as the air around me grew heavier. I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't respond. When the figure got close enough, one of the shadows extended toward me, touching my chest. I felt a coldness that seemed to cut through my soul. My vision darkened, and the last thing I heard before passing out was the sound of a whisper repeating my name. I woke on the floor, not knowing how much time had passed. The room was silent, and the lights had returned. But something inside me was different. It was no longer just fear or paranoia. It was a sense that I was no longer alone in my own body. I rushed to the bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection. The marks now covered almost my entire torso, climbing up to my neck and down my arms. They weren't just glowing, they were completely alive. And for a moment, I saw something that made my heart stop. My eyes, once brown, were now tinged with a golden hue. Panic overtook me. I grabbed my things and left the hotel without looking back. I drove for hours without a clear destination, feeling like I had to keep moving. As I drove, I realized the voices were becoming more constant. They no longer just whispered, they were beginning to give instructions. Return to Toulouse. Finish what was started. Open the way completely. These words terrified me more than anything I had faced so far. They weren't just suggestions, they were commands, and I felt something within me responding to them, even against my will. I stopped at a gas station and tried to collect myself. Inside, a television was tuned to the news, and it caught my attention. The anchor was reporting on an unusual event. Strange lights have been seen in the skies over Narbonne and Toulouse tonight. Local authorities still have no explanations for the phenomenon. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, but something else drew my attention. As the anchor described the phenomenon, the image on the screen switched to security footage, showing a man walking down an empty street in Toulouse. It was my contact. He was still there. My mind was divided. Part of me wanted to follow the voice's orders and return to Toulouse. Another part of me knew I was being manipulated, that going back would mean something far worse than anything I had already faced. But deep down, I knew I had no choice. I drove straight to Toulouse, my mind spinning with possibilities. When I arrived, the streets were empty, so different from the vibrant festival that had filled the city weeks before. I followed the instinct that now seemed to guide my every move. The map that had once been my guide was burned into my mind. I knew exactly where to go, the same place where it all began. When I arrived, the cafe was in ruins. The entrance was covered with debris, but I managed to find a way into the basement. That's where my contact was waiting for me. "You came back." His voice was weak, almost unrecognizable. "What's happening to me?" I asked, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Why do I feel like I'm losing control?" He laughed, but it was a humorless laugh, filled with resignation. "Because you're the chosen one, Thomas. And there's nothing you can do to change that." Before I could ask more, the ground began to shake. The walls started to crack, and the same low, almost pulsating sound I had heard at the hotel filled the space. "It's starting," he said as the shadows around us began to move again. And this time, I knew there was no escape. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, as if something buried deep was trying to rise. The basement walls warped slightly, as though they were alive, pulsing in time with the marks on my skin. My contact stood still, watching the cracks spreading across the ceiling, as though he knew exactly what was about to happen. "Thomas," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos around us, "it's time." "Time for what?" I shouted, struggling to be heard over the deep, almost rhythmic hum that grew louder. "Tell me." He turned to face me, and for the first time, his eyes were different. They were no longer the eyes of an ordinary man. There was something dark and bottomless in them, something that seemed to swallow the light around him. "For you to accept your role." Before I could react, an invisible force pushed me backward. I was thrown against one of the basement walls, the impact knocking the air out of my lungs. As I tried to stand, I felt something moving beneath my skin, as if the marks on my body were expanding, growing. The pain was unbearable, but what followed was even worse. The shadows in the basement began to converge at the center of the room, forming a slowly rotating spiral. The air around us grew dense, as if space itself was being distorted. My contact knelt down, his arms raised in reverence to the growing darkness. "This is how it ends, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and despair. "Or rather, how it all begins." The shadowy spiral began to solidify, taking on a form that defied logic or description. It was a presence, something that should not exist but was now here, filling the space with its own reality. Its silhouette shifted constantly, as though my mind could not fully grasp what it was seeing. I felt an intense heat emanating from within me. The marks on my skin burned like embers, and suddenly, I realized I was part of it. Whatever was being summoned was using me as a channel. "No!" I shouted, trying to resist the force that now seemed to consume me. But the voice within me grew stronger than ever. "Stop resisting. Accept what you are." Each word felt like a sentence, and no matter how hard I fought, something inside me began to yield. My contact rose to his feet and approached the spiral. He seemed almost ecstatic, as if he was finally witnessing something he had long awaited. "You are only the beginning, Thomas. The first of many." "The first of what?" I managed to ask, my voice weak and broken. He smiled, a smile devoid of any humanity. "The new order." The words had barely left his mouth when the spiral of shadows exploded into light. It wasn't ordinary light. It pierced through my vision, striking directly into my mind. I shut my eyes, but it made no difference. The light was everywhere, and with it came a flood of images. I saw cities burning, skies painted red, and crowds kneeling before beings that were not human. I saw the marks on my skin spreading to others like a plague, connecting them all to a single entity. And then, I saw what lay at the center of it all, an indescribable figure, both an observer and the creator of the chaos. When the light finally faded, I collapsed to the floor, exhausted. The shadows were gone, and the basement was silent once again. My contact stood, but something about him had changed. He seemed empty. His eyes were fixed on me, yet there was no life left in them. "You've completed the cycle, Thomas," he said, his voice a distant echo, as if it came from far away. "Now it's all up to you." Before I could ask what he meant, he dropped to his knees and collapsed, as though his very essence had been drained. I was alone in the basement, the weight of the responsibility he had placed on me crushing every thought I tried to form. I climbed back to the surface, expecting to find a familiar world. But it was no longer the same. Toulouse was bathed in a strange twilight, though it was the middle of the night. The sky was covered with thick clouds that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The streets were deserted, but there was something in the air, a feeling that I was being watched, followed, even though no one was there. As I walked through the city, I noticed that the marks on my skin had grown hotter, brighter. It was as if they were connected to something greater, something that now called to me. Finally, I reached the city center, where it had all begun. The main square, still adorned with remnants of the festival. At the center of the square, a figure awaited me. It was Adrian. "I knew you'd come, Thomas," he said, his voice calm, almost comforting. "What have you done to me?" I asked, my anger outweighing my fear. "I did nothing." He stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a golden light. "You've always been part of this." He raised his hand, and immediately I felt an intense heat in my chest. Looking down, I saw the marks beginning to expand, spreading across my entire body in seconds. The pain was unbearable, but amid the agony, something became clear. I was the channel. The voices within me had been right. I wasn't just a spectator of the rituals, I was the catalyst. Everything that had happened up to that moment, the rituals, the marks, the visions, had been planned to lead me here. "Now you understand, don't you?" Adrian asked, his tone almost gentle. "You can't escape what you were born to be." And then, as if a veil had been lifted, I saw the truth. I wasn't just part of the plan. I was the plan. The world as I knew it had ended, and I was responsible for ushering it into its new era. When Adrian uttered those words, something within me broke. I felt as though my body was no longer my own. Every cell pulsed with an unnatural energy, as if something far greater was trying to manifest through me. The marks glowed intensely now, spreading across my face, hands, and even my fingers. The heat radiating from them was unbearable, but at the same time, it brought a strange sense of power, as though I was connected to something limitless, something ancient. "What have you done to me?" I asked again, my voice now weaker, almost a whisper. Adrian smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was an empty gesture, devoid of empathy or warmth. "You're finally accepting it, Thomas. What began in Toulouse wasn't just the awakening of an entity. It was your awakening. You are the channel, but you're also the vessel. Without you, the cycle cannot be completed." "Cycle?" I asked, trying to comprehend, though each of his words seemed to erode my sanity. "What cycle?" Adrian stepped closer, the golden glow in his eyes growing brighter, almost blinding. "Humanity always believed it was in control, Thomas. But we are merely fragments of something greater, pieces in a game that began long before we existed. You were chosen to open the door, to bring back the balance." "Balance?" I laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Is this what you call balance? Lights in the sky, people disappearing, something consuming me from within?" "You still don't understand," Adrian replied, his tone patient, as though he were speaking to a child who didn't know any better. "What's coming isn't destruction, Thomas. It's renewal." Before I could respond, another wave of pain shot through my body. I fell to my knees, the cold ground of the square beneath me. The marks shone so brightly now that I could barely see. Adrian remained still, watching as the pain intensified, an indifferent spectator to my suffering. "They're ready," he he said, looking toward the sky. I forced my eyes upward, and what I saw made me wish I'd never come to Toulouse. The clouds that once pulsed now seemed fully alive, shifting as though made of something organic. They were massive, covering the entire sky above the city, and at their center was a shape. It was indistinct, impossible to define, but its presence was overwhelming. The shape pulsed, each movement sending waves of energy that made the ground tremble. Something was trying to cross over, something that shouldn't exist in our world. "What is that?" I asked, my voice failing. "It's the end of one cycle and the beginning of another," Adrian said, gazing at the shape with reverence. "Humanity needs to be rewritten, Thomas, and you will be the author." His words hit me with brutal clarity. I wasn't just a channel or a vessel. I was the catalyst. All the energy from the rituals, the chants, the marks, it all converged in me. And now, that colossal being was nearing our reality, using me as its final portal. Something inside me rebelled. "No," I whispered, fighting against the pain and the force consuming me. "I won't let this happen." Adrian laughed, a dry and cruel sound. "You think you have a choice? It's already too late, Thomas." I struggled to my feet, my legs trembling under the weight of the energy that now seemed to radiate from me. The voices in my mind were louder than ever, screaming commands, begging me to surrender. But there was another voice, a faint voice, buried beneath all the chaos. My Ovenfoitha. I focused on it, clinging to the last remnants of my humanity. Adrian watched me with curiosity, as if waiting to see what I would do. "You don't understand what you're doing, Thomas," he said, his expression remaining serene. "Resistance is futile." I ignored his words. I closed my eyes and allowed my mind to journey inward, to the core of the energy consuming me. The heat, the pain, the marks, all of it was part of something greater, but it was also part of me. I was still Thomas Valet. When I opened my eyes again, Adrian stepped back. "No," he muttered, and for the first time, I saw something resembling fear in his eyes. "You shouldn't be able to." Before he could finish, a wave of energy burst from within me. It wasn't something I could fully control. It was instinctive, a release of everything inside me. Adrian was thrown backward, crashing to the ground with force. The shape in the sky reacted. It stopped pulsing, its edges trembling as though hesitating. "I can't let this happen," I said, my voice steady despite the pain still burning in my body. "No matter what you or it planned." Adrian slowly rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "You're toying with forces you can't comprehend." "Maybe I don't comprehend them," I replied, taking a step forward despite the crushing weight of the energy surrounding me. "But I can stop them." With each word, I felt the energy within me aligning, becoming something I could wield. I didn't know how, but I realized I had power over it. I wasn't just a vessel, I had a choice. I raised my hands, and the marks on my skin glowed once more, but this time, it wasn't something I feared. It was something I controlled. I focused everything on the shape in the sky, channeling the energy from within me. The shape screamed, or perhaps it was my mind interpreting the sound it made. But in that moment, I knew I had broken something. The pulsing stopped. The clouds began to dissipate slowly, and the oppressive weight over the city started to lift. Adrian fell to his knees, staring at me in disbelief. "You don't know what you've done," he muttered, his voice filled with despair. "Maybe not," I replied, exhausted, feeling my body give out. "But at least I know I did the right thing." And then, everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying in the square. The sky was clear, and the city was silent. Adrian was gone, as were the marks on my skin. But something told me it wasn't over. I could feel it. Something inside me was still there, dormant, waiting. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this mystery captivated you. But I bet you haven't seen everything yet. Click on the next videos now to continue your journey into the unknown. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next secrets I'm about to reveal. But be careful, once you step inside, there's no turning back.